Jordan Peterson fundamentally misunderstands the spirit of the West, and because of this, he also fundamentally misunderstands Nietzsche. And here is why. The thesis of all modern moralities, from Christianity to liberalism and leftism, is that the domestication of man is a good thing. But what if the opposite is the case? What if the greatest danger to mankind is precisely this domestication of man? And what if the so-called good man is our greatest danger? This is what Nietzsche asks in the preface of his Genealogy of Morals. This is the first of Nietzsche's books which I read, and it blew my mind. I remember the day very well. It was my sophomore year of college, and I was sitting under a tree on a nice sunny day, and as I read, I stood up and I began to pace back and forth. It was as if Nietzsche had finally voiced my deepest suspicions about the modern world, and as if someone for the first time had finally affirmed my deepest instincts. Now, I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent into my childhood, but this is very important because at the end of the day, all of these abstract ideas about religion, about philosophy, about the so-called West are lived and embodied, and if they are not, they do not matter. From a very young age, I always had an anti-civilization sentiment. As I would lay in bed before I fell asleep, I would imagine myself living in fantasy worlds, and these worlds were always set in prehistoric times when I was living a wild, tribal, hunter-gatherer life, or in post-apocalyptic times when civilization had been wiped away and I was living in the ruins of what once was. I fantasized about the thrill of the hunt, running on the open plain with a spear in hand, about the raw connection of kinship and brotherhood in a world which is reduced to elemental survival. I dreamt of the beauty and quiet of laying under a sky bright with stars, of an untamed world with endless horizons. Modernity, modern life, modern civilization repulsed me because it seemed false, dishonest, like a facade pulled over reality. It seemed like we were living in this delicate, fake world which could collapse at any moment. At any moment, the curtain of modernity could be torn back to reveal the raw truth of nature underneath. And I think my instincts were pointing me in the right direction, because as I often talk about, a lot of the problems that we have today come from the fact that in this hyper-civilized world, we refuse to deal with reality. We cover up reality with idealized abstractions, and reality itself, even basic things like fundamental biological realities like gender, have become taboo. As I got older and I began to encounter post-apocalyptic media like The Walking Dead, which portrayed a world returned to the natural state of survival, my anti-civilization stance only got stronger. I remember looking out the window on the drive on the way to school and imagining all of the buildings, all of the ugly signs and gas stations, the asphalt of the highway being torn up behind the car and giving way to forest. I believed that it would be a good thing if civilization were eradicated completely. And I believed that it was going to happen. I believed that we were soon going to experience some sort of apocalyptic event because I thought that something so artificial could not last for long. I had unknowingly basically adopted a philosophy resembling that of Ted Kaczynski. But in the later years of high school, I began to get into psychology and philosophy. I read Freud's Civilization and its Discontents, which was very on theme with my ideology at the time, and then I read a little bit of Jung, and Jung got me into Peterson. And Jordan Peterson made me pro-civilization for the first time in my life. Since I'd always been drawn to the ancient Greeks, the Romans, the Norse, the chivalric knights as a child, Jordan Peterson's romantic vision of Western civilization as something worth preserving captured me. And as I went off to college to study ancient Greece and Rome, I saw that there was good in civilization, and I wanted to save Western civilization. By that time, I was very into Carl Jung, and I was trying to read through his entire collected works, and I was keeping a dream journal and analyzing my dreams. Now, this is where we're going to get to the juicy stuff. During the winter of my freshman year of college, I had a very interesting dream. I was a colonist on a lush forested island, and I was wearing Roman garb, and I had with me a brother, an evil brother who had betrayed me. We were there to civilize this island and build a city on it. Then the evil brother and I began to fight, and I was watching this from a third-person perspective. The evil brother won, stabbing the good brother, but at the last minute I intervened and made it so that the good brother won. Because ever since I was a child, I have always been able to lucid dream and to interfere in dreams. I can often change the ending of a dream or rewind a dream or interfere in the plot in some way. So the dream dictated that the evil brother won, but my ego intervened and changed the ending. As a child, I had received, through the prevailing liberal moral paradigm, the idea that to be good was to be self-sacrificial and charitable. I had essentially received a version of Christian virtue through liberalism, even though I wasn't raised Christian. And in this moral worldview, which I had received subconsciously, the instincts, the animal instincts, violence, sexuality, and so on, were bad and should be restrained, suppressed, and overcome. Those instincts are what had dominated throughout all of history, but finally we had overcome them. Finally, we had become enlightened, and we were now good, charitable, kind, liberal people. But as a son of Rome, my ancestry is majority Italian, and like most young men, women and war were my greatest fascinations even as a young child. This was no issue on the surface. Most young men are fascinated by knights, by pirates, by hoplite warriors, slaughtering each other, by gore, by heroism, though I was probably fascinated by these things more than anyone I knew. But what disturbed me was that the desires of my soul, seen in my nighttime fantasies of living a wild, uncivilized, untamed life, were so completely opposed to everything which I perceived to be considered moral and civilized by the society which I lived in. I did not want to be tame, meek, self-sacrificial, and so on. I wanted the thrill of the hunt, and I wanted the destruction of all the pretenses of civilization. But I felt guilty about this because I perceived it to be wrong. So in my mind, I developed a conception of my soul as two brothers. One light brother, essentially representing my ego and a kind of liberal or Christian virtue, and the other a dark brother, representing the wild animal instincts. And I would associate different thoughts and desires with one or the other. And you could see why Freud and Jung immediately fascinated me with their ideas about the ego and the id, or the ego and the shadow. And you'll see that with this context, the meaning of the dream becomes clear. The island was my uncivilized, untamed childhood self, and it needed to finally take form in adulthood. It needed to be civilized. But there was a war for who would solidify and form my adult identity, a war between two brothers. The dark brother, the brother who represented the instincts and this anti-civilization urge, and the other who represented the light brother, my ego, which contained all of the moral impressions which I had received from my society. And in the end, according to the dream, the dark brother won, even though I interfered. It was soon after that I began reading Nietzsche, and he gave a voice to that untamed side of my soul, the silent instincts that were not allowed civilized expression. And what would effectively happen over the course of the following years was that the good brother, the liberal Christian conception of the good man, was sacrificed, torn apart, as I fully came into the worldview which I had always instinctually believed in. And thus I was set on the path to becoming who I am today. Now you might have noticed that this dream also had mythological significance. Two brothers wearing Roman garb, warring for who will found a new civilization on an untamed land. Does it sound familiar? Romulus and Remus, of course. Rome, the city, the civilization, was founded through the act of murder, through Romulus's murder of Remus. Could my dream have been telling me that I, as a son of Rome, was descended from Romulus, not Remus? The formation of my adult identity had to come through the sacrifice of one brother by another, of the sacrifice of liberal morality by my more ancient primal instincts. by the sacrifice of the half of my soul which represented my ego and the liberal moral consensus. Now, you might think this kind of mythological ancestral memory is a bit of a stretch, but in the field of epigenetics, we are starting to learn more and more that different behaviors, impressions, habits, even fears can be passed down. Every people has their own unique genetic makeup and history. So couldn't it be the same with gods? A specific god clicks with your unique physiology. Specific gods, specific myths even represent your very soul and the collective soul of your ancestors. For the Romans, Mars, the god of war and agriculture. For the Germanic peoples, Odin, the god of frenzy, poetry, and battle. It's just something to think about. Around this time, I had a second dream. I was at my grandmother's house where I spent much of my childhood looking out over the backyard, and in the backyard there was a pen of donkeys. The donkeys were crying out to me, and I knew that they were once children who had been turned into donkeys, like in Pinocchio. I called out to one of the donkeys and said, "Speak. If only you can speak, you will be turned back into a child." But to my shock and horror, the donkey transformed into a wolf and devoured all of the other donkeys in the pen. Now, the meaning of this dream is pretty clear. The donkey is a domestic animal, a bleating, helpless, foolish creature. The children, which represented me, had been turned into this strange, domesticated animal. And I thought that the power of the word, the power of speech, the power of logos could transform them back into children. Both the idea of the logos here and the reference to Pinocchio evoke Jordan Peterson, since I had been watching his lectures on Pinocchio a little bit earlier. My dream was telling me that Jordan Peterson was wrong. The logos could not save me, and I did not need to be transformed back into a child. Instead, I had to become a wolf and devour the child in me, devour the domestic creature which I had become. And I believe this dream also had a mythological meaning. Romulus and Remus were the sons of Mars, raised in the wilderness by a she-wolf. The dream was telling me that I was not meant to be a domestic donkey. It was telling me that I was the son of a wolf. The donkey, on the other hand, often represents Jesus. He rode into town on the back of a donkey, and what may be one of the earliest depictions which we have of Jesus appears to be a crucified man with a donkey's head. Peterson would have all Westerners be sons of Jesus, sons of Christian civilization, but my dream was telling me that I was the son of a wolf, the symbol of pre-Christian Rome, not Jesus the donkey. My soul was pagan, not Christian. Another mythological association is the reconstructed Choreos or Mannerbund ritual of the ancient Europeans and Indo-Europeans. It is believed that in order to transition into adulthood, young men would be cast out of the tribe, where they would take on the spiritual and symbolic role of wolves and even dress like them. My dream was telling me that in order to transition from a child to an adult, I had to embrace the wolf inside of me. As I sensed from a very young age, the reason why modern civilization is so unnatural is because it denies our fundamental nature. Just as your body becomes weak, frail, and atrophied if it is not used, and it is denied the full expression of its potential grace and beauty and strength, so it is with the soul, with the instincts, when they have no outlet and are therefore forced to atrophy. But these instinctual energies, when they are denied expression in civilization, do not just go away. You can't just make your sexuality, your aggression, and all of your other instincts disappear. Instead, they are sublimated, and they come out in other ways, in much stranger ways, and sometimes much crueler ways. Nietzsche wrote about this, saying that as civilization becomes more complex, violence does not go away. It just becomes more and more sublimated, and in a certain way more cruel and vindictive. You see this today with a kind of indirect social violence, with political correctness, moral correctness, cancel culture. All of the stuff which you see on the internet is a kind of subverted violence. You also see a kind of cruelty inflicted upon the young man who is never initiated into adulthood. Though he might have to go through hardships to be initiated. The lack of initiation puts him through a different kind of suffering because he is never allowed to fully develop. You see sublimated violence in the cruelty of the schooling system, which beats the creativity out of children and forces them to submit to the whims of often unpleasant teachers. And you see the instincts come out in all sorts of other ways, in strange addictions, all sorts of strange expressions of identity, and most of all in the drive to self-destruction, which is implicit in all of these strange behaviors and addictions. But all of this can be avoided through ritual. Ritual connects the individual with their instincts, and it teaches them the proper relationship with their instincts. It teaches them how to understand, how to contextualize, how to express and relate to these ancient forces which live within us, which are us. This was the purpose of the Choreos ritual. It taught the young man about his nature and initiated him into manhood. But today we have no such rituals. As I've talked about in other videos, I believe that it's important to substitute these rituals with other activities, like going to the gym, learning a fighting sport, spending time in nature, and so on. But when we find ourselves in the position that we are in now, with no institutional or cultural guidance, the only way out is through a deep psychological searching of your soul and a radical acceptance and embrace of your nature. And I believe that to do this, you need to investigate the mythologies and gods of your people, for it is through these that you will best understand your own nature and the destiny which arises from that nature. And though we all have different gods, the Choreos ritual seems to be a cross-cultural memory in Europe and across the steppe. And what is vitally important now is that we in the West remember that we are not sheep and donkeys, not helpless prey animals to be herded and caged. We are the sons of Odin and Mars. We are the sons of wolves.
If you're interested in learning more about the worldview of the ancient pagan cultures of Europe, the ARC's Heroic Literature course and community is linked in the description.